the man took in a wounded, feral orange cat. But when he discovered the truth, his world turned upside down. Arthur Miller often felt like a relic himself, quietly existing in the over-the-Rhine neighborhood of Cincinnati. The historic brick buildings, with their ornate 19th century details, stood as testaments to a vibrant past, much like the sepia-toned photographs tucked away in his modest apartment. At 52, Arthur worked as an archivist for the city library, a job that suited his meticulous nature and his preference for the company of the past over the often jarring present. His life was orderly, quiet, and marked by a persistent low hum of loneliness he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. The echoes of the 2008 financial crisis, which had dismantled his family's small printing business and scattered his siblings to different states chasing new starts, still resonated in the careful way he managed his finances and the deliberate simplicity of his existence. His route home from the library often took him through a network of alleys, shortcuts known mostly to locals and stray animals. It was on one crisp evening in late October, with the scent of decaying leaves sharp in the air and the sky bleeding orange and purple, that he first saw him. A flash of ginger fur against the grimy brickwork of Sycamore Alley. The cat was a mess, painfully thin, its once bright coat matted and dull, clinging to sharp bones. Scars, pale lines against the darker fur, crisscrossed its face and flanks, testament to a hard life fought on the unforgiving streets. Arthur's heart, a place usually guarded and still, gave a painful lurch. He'd always had a soft spot for animals, a trait inherited from his mother. He stopped, keeping a respectful distance. "Hey there, fella," he murmured, his voice soft, careful not to startle. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The cat flattened its ears, its back arched, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Its lips peeled back to reveal surprisingly sharp teeth, and its green eyes, narrowed to slits, burned with a mixture of terror and defiance. When Arthur took an unconscious half-step forward, a paw, claws fully extended, lashed out with startling speed, striking the air inches from his hand. Arthur froze, then slowly retracted his hand. "Okay, okay," he soothed, holding his palms up slightly. "Easy does it. I'm not going to hurt you." The cat didn't relax, its body coiled like a spring, ready to fight or flee. Arthur recognized the look, not just aggression, but profound fear. This wasn't just a feral cat defending its territory. This was an animal deeply traumatized, expecting pain from every interaction. He backed away slowly, his heart heavy. He couldn't force help on the creature, but neither could he simply walk away and forget the image of those haunted green eyes. That night, sleep eluded him. He thought about the cat, alone in the cooling autumn night, skinny and afraid. The next day, Arthur detoured on his way home, stopping at a small corner store. He bought a can of tuna packed in oil and a small disposable foil dish. Back in Sycamore Alley, he found the orange cat huddled near an overflowing dumpster, warily watching a pair of pigeons. Keeping a much greater distance this time, Arthur crouched down. He slowly opened the can, the pungent, oily scent filling the narrow space. He spooned the tuna into the foil dish and gently slid it across the cracked pavement, stopping about 10 feet from the cat. Then he retreated another 10 feet and sat down on an overturned bucket someone had discarded, making himself small and unthreatening. The cat watched his every move, tense and suspicious. It glanced at the tuna, then back at Arthur, its nose twitching. Hunger warred visibly with fear. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic and the cooing of the pigeons who wisely kept their distance from the offering. Finally, driven by desperate hunger, the cat darted forward, snatched a mouthful of tuna, and retreated instantly to its spot by the dumpster, swallowing quickly, eyes never leaving Arthur. It repeated this several times. A quick dash, a mouthful, a hasty retreat, until the dish was empty. It gave a perfunctory lick to its whiskers, shot Arthur one last suspicious glare, and melted back into the deeper shadows of the alley. Arthur let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the wall of fear. This became their ritual. Every evening, Arthur would bring food, sometimes tuna, sometimes canned cat food, occasionally leftover chicken from his own dinner. He'd place the dish down, retreat to his bucket, and wait patiently. He never tried to approach, never spoke above a quiet murmur. He simply offered food and silent companionship from a safe distance. Weeks turned into a month. The cat, whom Arthur had mentally started calling Rusty for its coloring and its rough condition, slowly began to change. The sharp edges of its ribs became less prominent. Its coat, while still dirty, seemed a fraction less matted. More significantly, the pattern of eating changed. Rusty no longer snatched and retreated. Instead, it would eat cautiously at the dish, though it still kept a wary eye on Arthur. The growling became less frequent, replaced by a tense stillness. It would even linger for a few minutes after finishing the food, watching Arthur from its safe zone near the dumpster. Arthur found himself looking forward to these brief, silent encounters. They punctuated the predictable rhythm of his days with a small spark of anticipation. He started talking to Rusty softly while the cat ate, telling it about his day at the library, the books he'd cataloged, the changing weather. He didn't expect a response, of course, but the act of speaking seemed to bridge the silence, to make the alley feel a little less desolate. Rusty never responded, never moved closer, and certainly never allowed Arthur any closer than that 10-foot buffer zone. Any sudden movement, any slight raising of Arthur's voice, and the cat would tense, ready to bolt. The invisible wall remained firmly in place. Arthur knew forcing the issue would destroy the fragile, tentative understanding they had reached. Patience was the only tool he had. Winter began to creep into Cincinnati. The air grew colder, the winds sharper. Frost rimmed the puddles in the alley each morning. Arthur started bringing warmer, calorie-rich food, and sometimes a small fleece blanket he would leave near Rusty's usual spot. Though he never saw the cat use it, he worried constantly about Rusty surviving the freezing nights. Where did it sleep? How did it stay warm? He tried setting up a small makeshift shelter, using a sturdy cardboard box and some old towels, tucking it into a recessed doorway further down the alley. Rusty eyed it with extreme suspicion and never went near it. Arthur felt a pang of frustration, quickly followed by empathy. Trust, once broken, was a difficult thing to rebuild, especially when the breaker had been humanity itself. He had no idea what horrors this cat had endured, but its reactions spoke volumes. One particularly bleak evening in early December, a cold, driving rain began to fall. It wasn't snow, but a miserable, bone-chilling downpour that turned the alley into a slick, dark channel. Arthur hurried, his umbrella barely offering protection against the wind-whipped drops. He found Rusty huddled miserably under the narrow overhang of a boarded-up window, shivering violently. Its fur was plastered to its thin body, and it looked smaller and more wretched than ever. Arthur's heart ached. He quickly set down the food dish, closer than usual this time, only about 5 feet away. Rusty didn't growl, didn't hiss. It just watched him, its green eyes wide and luminous in the gloom, reflecting the dim light filtering from the street. It was shivering too hard to move, too miserable to muster its usual defenses. This was different. The sheer vulnerability radiating from the little creature cut through Arthur's usual caution. He couldn't just leave it like this. The rain lashed down, drumming against Arthur's umbrella and pooling around his worn leather shoes. Rusty remained frozen under the meager shelter of the window ledge, a picture of abject misery. The shivering wasn't just a tremor, it was a full-body quake that shook its small frame relentlessly. The usual fire of defiance in its eyes was banked, replaced by a stark, primal fear mixed with utter exhaustion. Arthur's carefully constructed wall of non-interference crumbled. Seeing the cat like this, so completely at the mercy of the elements, activated a protective instinct he couldn't ignore. He set down his umbrella, letting the cold rain soak his hair and jacket immediately. Moving slowly, deliberately, he crouched down a few feet away from Rusty, making himself as small as possible. "Hey, Rusty," he said, his voice barely audible above the downpour. "You're soaked clear through. You can't stay out here like this, buddy." The cat flinched at the closeness of his voice, but didn't bolt. It just watched him, water dripping from its whiskers, its breath misting faintly in the cold air. Arthur could see the rapid rise and fall of its sides, the desperate effort it took just to breathe against the cold. He stayed there for a long moment, letting Rusty acclimatize to his proximity. Then, summoning every ounce of calm he possessed, he extended his hand, palm down, moving with glacial slowness. He wasn't aiming to touch, not yet. He just wanted to close the distance slightly to offer a silent signal of intent. Help, not harm. Rusty tensed. A low, weak growl vibrated in its chest, but it lacked the usual conviction. Its eyes were locked on Arthur's approaching hand, wide with apprehension. Arthur stopped his hand about a foot away from the cat's body. He held it perfectly still. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's just me. I just want to help you get dry, get warm." He waited. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The rain continued its relentless assault. Rusty shivered, looked at the hand, looked back at the relative dryness of its miserable perch, then back at the hand. It seemed torn, its survival instincts screaming conflicting messages: flee the potential threat, seek shelter from the immediate danger. Then something shifted. The cat didn't relax, not exactly, but the rigid tension eased almost imperceptibly. It stopped growling. Its gaze remained fixed on Arthur's hand, but the outright terror began to recede, replaced by a kind of wary resignation. it stayed put. Taking this as the barest flicker of permission, Arthur moved his hand forward again, infinitely slowly. He aimed for the cat's shoulder, avoiding the head, which often feels more threatening. His fingers, numb with cold, finally brushed against the wet, matted fur. Rusty flinched violently, pulling back slightly but didn't lash out. Arthur immediately froze his hand again. "Easy," he murmured. "Just easy." He kept his hand there, barely making contact. He could feel the frantic hammering of the cat's heart through the soaked fur, the tremors racking its body. He didn't stroke, didn't pet. He just let his hand rest there, a point of potential warmth, a symbol of non-aggression. After another long moment, Arthur very gently, very slowly applied the slightest pressure, a non-threatening resting weight. Rusty endured it. Encouraged, Arthur slowly, carefully, began to ease his hand along the cat's back, moving with the grain of the fur. And that's when his fingers brushed against it. Beneath the wet, clumping fur hidden from view was a ridge of thickened, puckered skin. It wasn't just a surface scratch. It felt deep, wide, and old. A significant scar running several inches down the cat's back. As his fingers traced its length, Arthur felt a sudden, sickening certainty. This wasn't the result of a fight with another animal. The straightness, the unnatural feel of it, this scar felt like the legacy of a human hand, perhaps wielding something sharp or heavy. A wave of understanding washed over Arthur, cold and stark as the rain. Rusty wasn't just afraid of being touched, it was terrified of being hurt again. Its aggression wasn't malice. It was a desperate defense mechanism born from past trauma, likely inflicted by someone who should have offered kindness, but instead delivered pain. The image of this small creature already fighting for survival, being deliberately harmed, sent a surge of protective anger through him. "Oh, buddy," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "What did they do to you?" He gently withdrew his hand. Rusty watched him, still shivering, but perhaps a fraction less terrified than before. Arthur knew he couldn't leave the cat here. He carefully picked up his umbrella and opened it again, holding it partially over Rusty, offering a slightly larger dry patch. "Okay," Arthur said, making a decision. "New plan." He took off his rain-soaked jacket. It wasn't much, but the wool blend held some warmth, even when damp. He carefully, slowly, draped it over the shivering cat, creating a sort of loose tent. Rusty startled but huddled deeper under the unexpected covering. Arthur stood up, chilled to the bone but resolute. He couldn't force Rusty to come home with him, not yet, but he could make the alley slightly less hostile. He hurried back to his apartment, just a couple of blocks away. Ignoring his own discomfort, he grabbed a large plastic storage bin, several old thick towels, and a self-heating pet mat he'd bought years ago for a previous, long-departed pet and never gotten rid of. Back in the alley, Rusty was still huddled under the jacket. Arthur worked quickly but calmly, placing the storage bin on its side in the most sheltered spot he could find, away from the worst of the rain and wind. He lined it thickly with the dry towels and placed the heating mat underneath the bottom layer. He then retrieved his damp jacket, carefully coaxing Rusty out from under it. He expected the cat to bolt, but it seemed too weak and cold. Arthur gently guided it, nudging more than pushing towards the opening of the bin. "Come on, fella, it's dry here, it's warm." Hesitantly sniffing the strange plastic and unfamiliar towels, Rusty took a tentative step inside. It felt the warmth radiating from the mat beneath the towels. It paused, then slowly crept all the way in, turning around a few times before curling into a tight ball, burying its nose under its tail. Arthur watched, relief washing over him. He placed the dish of food, now soggy with rain, just inside the entrance of the bin. He knew Rusty might still flee later, might never trust the shelter completely, but for tonight, it was safe. It was dry. It was warm. From that rainy night forward, Arthur's approach shifted. The discovery of the scar hadn't just explained Rusty's behavior, it had forged a deeper bond of empathy in Arthur. His patience, already considerable, deepened into a quiet, unwavering commitment. He understood he wasn't just taming a stray, he was helping a traumatized soul heal. He continued the feeding routine, but now he always sat closer, gradually decreasing the distance day by day, inch by inch. He talked more, his voice always low and soothing. He started leaving his worn library sweater near the shelter, hoping Rusty would associate his scent with safety and warmth. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, Rusty began to respond. It started allowing Arthur to sit just a few feet away while it ate inside its warm bin. Tentative touches, first just a finger brushing against its side as it ate, then a brief, gentle stroke along its back, carefully avoiding the scar tissue, were tolerated, then grudgingly accepted. The first time Rusty didn't flinch away from his touch, Arthur felt a thrill of quiet triumph. He began leaving the door to his ground-floor apartment building propped open slightly during their evening meetings, letting the warm air and the sense of his home drift out into the alley. He placed Rusty's food dish just inside the doorway one evening. After a long hesitation, the cat darted inside, ate quickly, and darted back out. But it was another milestone. The progress was measured in millimeters, in moments snatched from fear. A brief rub against his leg as he set down the food. A moment of stillness, allowing a longer stroke. The gradual lessening of tension in the cat's body when Arthur was near. Each tiny victory felt monumental. Arthur knew he couldn't rush it. Healing took time, and trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt fragment by fragile fragment. He was prepared to wait as long as it took. The Cincinnati winter settled in earnest, bringing biting winds and occasional blankets of snow that muffled the city sounds. Sycamore Alley became a stark landscape of white and gray, but inside the plastic bin, lined with Arthur's cast-off sweaters and warmed by the heating mat, Rusty had a refuge. Arthur replaced the towels regularly, brought warm food twice a day now, and spent longer periods just sitting near the shelter, reading aloud from a book or simply talking in a low monotone. The propped open building door became part of the routine. Rusty grew bolder, venturing just inside the threshold to eat, lingering for a moment in the relative warmth of the hallway before retreating to the alley shelter. Arthur never tried to close the door or trap the cat. The choice always had to be Rusty's. One frigid evening in January, after finishing its meal just inside the hall, Rusty didn't immediately dart back outside. Instead, it sat near the doorway, washing its face meticulously, casting occasional glances at Arthur, who sat on the bottom step of the stairwell, pretending to read his mail. The cat seemed to be contemplating the space, the sounds from upstairs, muffled television, distant footsteps, the unfamiliar sense of cooked food, old wood, and Arthur himself. Arthur held his breath. This felt different. Rusty lingered for a full 10 minutes before finally, silently, slipping back out into the cold alley night. But the hesitation, the contemplation, felt like a significant shift. A few nights later, the breakthrough happened. It wasn't dramatic, but quiet and profound. Rusty came inside to eat, as usual. Arthur was sitting on the bottom step again. After eating, Rusty looked back towards the alley, then looked up the stairs, then looked at Arthur. It took a few tentative steps further into the hallway, tail held low but not tucked in fear. It sniffed at the worn runner carpet, then walked slowly over to Arthur's feet. It sniffed his sturdy winter boots, then, incredibly, rubbed its cheek against his ankle, just once, a fleeting contact, before moving to sit a few feet away, watching him. Arthur remained perfectly still, his heart pounding. He didn't reach out, didn't speak. He just let the moment happen. After a minute or two, Rusty stood up, stretched languidly, a gesture Arthur hadn't seen before, a sign of relative relaxation, and walked calmly back out to its shelter. From then on, the visits inside grew longer. Rusty would explore the small lobby area, sniff the mailboxes, peer cautiously up the stairwell. It started allowing Arthur to stroke its back while it was inside, sometimes even leaning into the touch momentarily. The low, hesitant rumble of a purr began to surface during these brief moments of contact, a sound so fragile Arthur strained to hear it. He knew the next step was inviting Rusty into his apartment, but he hesitated, worried about pushing too hard, too fast. He started leaving his apartment door just off the main hallway, slightly ajar when he knew Rusty was nearby. The invitation was accepted one snowy Saturday morning. Arthur had just put down fresh food in the hallway when Rusty came in, shaking snow from its coat. It ate, then instead of exploring the lobby, it walked directly to Arthur's open apartment door and peered inside. Arthur sat on the floor just inside his living room, holding a book. He said nothing, just watched. Rusty sniffed the threshold, one paw hovering over the worn wooden floor. It looked back at Arthur, then into the room, then back at Arthur. With infinite caution, it placed one paw inside, then another. Slowly, deliberately, it walked into Arthur's living room. It stopped just inside, its body tense, ears swiveling, taking in the sights and sounds of this new enclosed space. The ticking clock on the mantelpiece, the scent of old paper from Arthur's books, the faint aroma of coffee. Arthur stayed put, letting Rusty explore at its own pace. The cat moved cautiously, sniffing the legs of the armchair, the edge of the braided rug, the dusty bookshelf. It spent nearly half an hour investigating the small apartment, always keeping Arthur in its line of sight. Finally, seemingly satisfied for the moment, it walked back to the open door, gave Arthur one last look, and slipped back out into the hallway and presumably out to its alley shelter. But the barrier had been broken. Over the next few weeks, Rusty spent increasingly more time inside Arthur's apartment. It discovered the soft comfort of the old armchair, The warmth of the radiator, the intriguing gleam of dust motes dancing in the sunbeams slanting through the window. It still vanished for periods, likely returning to its familiar alley haunts or its established routines. But Arthur's apartment was clearly becoming a secondary base, a place of warmth and reliable food. The purr grew stronger, more frequent. Tentative kneading, claws carefully sheathed, began on the arm of the chair or sometimes, heart-stoppingly, on Arthur's leg when the cat felt particularly secure. The haunted look in its eyes began to soften, replaced by a cautious curiosity, sometimes even a flicker of contentment. Its coat, benefiting from regular food and less exposure, started to regain some of its ginger luster, though the scars remained pale reminders of its past. Then came the morning Arthur would never forget. He had fallen asleep on the sofa reading A Common Occurrence. He woke slowly, disoriented, feeling an unaccustomed weight and warmth on his chest. He blinked, focusing his eyes in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the curtains. Curled tightly in a ball, nestled directly over his heart, was Rusty, fast asleep. Its small body rose and fell with the steady rhythm of Arthur's breathing. A deep, resonant purr vibrated through its body and into Arthur's chest. Arthur lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, afraid to break the spell. This was it, the ultimate gesture of trust. After months of patience, fear, and slow incremental steps, this small, battered creature had finally decided he was safe. Not just safe to be near, but safe enough to be vulnerable with, to sleep upon. A wave of emotion, gratitude, tenderness, profound relief washed over Arthur, so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He carefully raised a hand and gently stroked the soft fur behind the cat's ears. The purr intensified, a contented rumble in the quiet room. For the first time since the painful scattering of his family years ago, Arthur didn't feel quite so alone. He lay there for a long time, simply savoring the moment, the warmth, the trust. As the room brightened with the morning sun, Rusty stirred. It stretched, blinked its green eyes open, and looked directly into Arthur's face from inches away. There was no fear, no tension, just a calm, quiet presence. It yawned, showing a pink tongue and surprisingly clean teeth, then settled back down, tucking its head under its chin as if preparing for a second nap. Arthur smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. They had made it. They had crossed the bridge. Later that morning, as Rusty sat calmly on the armchair grooming itself in a patch of sunlight, Arthur looked at it properly, truly seeing it perhaps for the first time without the filter of its trauma or his own cautious approach. He admired the way the light brought out the marmalade stripes in its fur, the intelligent alertness in its green eyes. Its left ear drooped slightly at the tip, another old injury perhaps, but it was the right ear that caught his attention. There, near the top edge, was a small clean notch, a perfect little V shape cut out of the ear cartilage. Arthur frowned. He'd seen marks like that before. It was a common practice in trap-neuter-return (TNR) programs to tip the ear of a feral cat that had been sterilized, a visual signal to avoid trapping it again. It made sense for a street cat like Rusty. But still, there was something about that specific notch, something naggingly familiar. It tickled a memory, distant and hazy. He watched Rusty meticulously lick a paw, the notched ear clearly visible. Where had he seen that before? He shook his head slightly. It was probably just a coincidence. Thousands of cats were ear-tipped. Yet the feeling persisted. A strange sense of unease mixed with dawning disbelief. He got up and walked over to the old wooden secretary desk, where he kept boxes of old photos and documents. The flotsam and jetsam of a life, saved by the archivist's instinct. He rarely looked through them. The memories were often double-edged. But the image of that notched ear urged him on. He pulled out a dusty box labeled Childhood 1990s. His hands trembled slightly as he sifted through fading Polaroids and drugstore prints, birthdays, holidays, awkward school pictures. And then he found it. A slightly blurry photo taken in the backyard of their old house, the one they'd lost after the business failed. It showed a much younger Arthur, maybe 10 or 11 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera, proudly holding a small, fluffy orange kitten. The kitten was squirming, trying to get down, but its face was clearly visible, its bright, curious eyes. And on its right ear, identical to the one on the cat currently washing itself in the sunbeam across the room, was a small, clean, V-shaped notch. Arthur's breath hitched. His heart felt like it had stopped beating altogether. He remembered now. They hadn't gotten the kitten from a shelter. It had been born to a neighbor's cat, and the neighbor had taken the whole litter to the vet for their first checkup and shots. The vet, perhaps practicing, perhaps just making a unique identifier, had given each kitten a tiny, painless ear notch. His kitten, the little orange terror he had named Marmalade, had the notch on the right ear. He looked from the photo to the cat in the armchair, then back to the photo. The resemblance, obscured by years of hardship and the transformation from kitten to battle-scarred adult, was suddenly, undeniably there. The specific shade of orange, the pattern of stripes on the forehead, the bright green eyes, and the notch. The irrefutable, impossible notch. It couldn't be. It was insane. Marmalade was gone, lost 15 years ago during the chaotic, heartbreaking move when everything fell apart. They hadn't abandoned him, not intentionally. In the frantic rush of packing, the stress of losing their home, amidst boxes and movers and shouting, Marmalade, already an indoor-outdoor cat despite Arthur's mother's worries, must have slipped out unnoticed. They searched for days, calling his name, posting flyers, their grief over losing their home compounded by the guilt and sorrow of losing their beloved pet. But Cincinnati was a big city, and Marmalade was just one small cat. They eventually had to leave, forced to relocate hours away to stay with relatives, leaving a piece of their hearts behind. Arthur, a teenager then, had been devastated. He'd never truly forgiven himself or the circumstances for losing his cat. And now, this street-hardened survivor, this fearful creature he had patiently coaxed back from the brink, this cat sleeping on his chest just hours ago. Arthur sank onto the edge of his desk chair, the old photograph trembling in his hand. His mind struggled to reconcile the pampered kitten in the picture with the scarred warrior in his living room. 15 years on the streets, surviving predators, traffic, starvation, cruel humans, brutal winters. It seemed impossible. But the notch was real. He looked over at Rusty, who had finished grooming and was now watching him with those intelligent green eyes. Arthur slowly lowered the photograph. Marmalade? he whispered, the name feeling foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue after so long. The cat's ears swiveled forward, its gaze sharpened slightly. It didn't react with recognition, not exactly, but there was a stillness, an attentiveness that hadn't been there before Arthur spoke the name. It wasn't Rusty. It had never been Rusty. It was Marmalade, his Marmalade, found again after 15 years of being lost. The truth, improbable and overwhelming, settled into Arthur's heart with the force of a physical blow, leaving him stunned, breathless, and utterly shocked. The silence in the small apartment stretched thick with unspoken history and dawning realization. Arthur stared at the cat, at Marmalade, seeing him now through a completely different lens. Every scar, every cautious movement, every flicker of fear in those green eyes took on a new, heart-wrenching meaning. This wasn't just a stray he had rescued. This was a piece of his own lost past, miraculously returned. Marmalade continued to watch him, head tilted slightly, perhaps sensing the shift in Arthur's demeanor, the sudden intensity of his gaze. The name, spoken aloud after so many years, seemed to hang in the air between them, an echo from a shared, distant life. Arthur slowly stood up and walked towards the armchair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He moved without his usual caution, propelled by a wave of emotion too powerful to contain. He knelt beside the chair, his eyes level with the cat's. "Marmalade," he said again, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It really is you, isn't it?" He reached out, not to the scarred back this time, but gently towards the cat's head, aiming for the soft fur behind the ears, a spot Marmalade used to love having scratched when he was a kitten. For a split second, Arthur expected the old defensiveness, the flinch, the warning hiss, but it didn't come. Instead, Marmalade leaned slightly into the touch, a low rumble starting deep in his chest. He closed his eyes briefly, a gesture of pure feline contentment that Arthur hadn't seen so unguarded before. It was a subtle shift, but profound. It felt like recognition, not of the name perhaps, but of the feeling, the familiar touch, the familiar presence buried deep beneath layers of trauma and survival instinct. Tears finally spilled over, tracking paths down Arthur's cheeks. The enormity of it washed over him. The sheer unlikeliness, the staggering odds Marmalade had overcome to survive for 15 years on the streets, the incredible coincidence, or perhaps fate, that had led their paths to cross again in this vast city. He thought back to the bankruptcy, the forced move, the chaos and despair of that time. His family had been overwhelmed, heartbroken, and stretched thin. Marmalade's disappearance had been another devastating blow in a series of losses. Arthur remembered his teenage self, desperately plastering lost cat posters with Marmalade's kitten picture onto telephone poles, calling his name until his voice was hoarse, searching the neighborhood relentlessly until they had to leave. The guilt had lingered for years, a dull ache beneath the surface, the feeling that he hadn't done enough, hadn't protected his companion. And all this time, Marmalade had been out there, fighting, surviving, enduring. The deep scar on his back, Arthur shuddered, imagining the cruelty that must have inflicted it. The fear of human hands wasn't irrational. It was a learned response, etched onto him by pain. Yet, somehow, through it all, some core of the trusting kitten Arthur had known must have remained, buried but not extinguished, enough for him to eventually, hesitantly, accept help from a stranger who smelled vaguely familiar, whose voice perhaps struck a deeply buried chord. Arthur gently stroked Marmalade's head, his fingers tracing the familiar shape of his skull beneath the fur. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I'm so sorry we lost you. I looked for you, I promise I did. We never stopped thinking about you." Marmalade opened his eyes and looked at Arthur, letting out a soft, questioning "Murrow?" It wasn't the demanding meow of a hungry cat, but something softer, more communicative. He nudged his head against Arthur's hand, then astonishingly reached out a paw, claws carefully sheathed, and placed it gently on Arthur's arm. It felt like forgiveness, like acceptance, like coming home. Arthur stayed there, kneeling by the chair, stroking the cat and murmuring apologies and reassurances. He told Marmalade about the years between, about his quiet life, about how he'd often thought of the vibrant little kitten who had brightened his childhood. He showed Marmalade the photograph, holding it carefully so the cat could see the image of his younger self. Marmalade sniffed at the glossy paper curiously, perhaps catching the faint, lingering scent of Arthur's younger hands from decades ago. The rest of the day passed in a haze of quiet emotion. Arthur moved slowly, gently, constantly aware of the small, resilient creature who had navigated unimaginable hardship to find his way back. He made a fresh bed for Marmalade in the warmest corner of the living room, using his softest old sweater. He opened a can of the most expensive salmon cat food he could find at the corner store, a silent apology for years of scavenging. Marmalade seemed to sense the change, the release of tension in Arthur. He explored the apartment with a newfound confidence, his tail held a little higher. He jumped onto the windowsill and watched the world outside, not with the hypervigilance of a stray assessing threats, but with the calm curiosity of a house cat observing its domain. He rubbed against Arthur's legs more frequently, his purr a near constant presence. That evening, as Arthur sat reading in his armchair, Marmalade didn't just jump onto the adjacent sofa. He leaped gracefully onto Arthur's lap, circled once, and settled down with a contented sigh, tucking his paws beneath his chest. He rested his head on Arthur's thigh, his notched ear soft against the worn denim of Arthur's jeans. Arthur looked down at the cat, this incredible survivor, this link to his past. 15 years, a lifetime for a cat. He had lost his family business, his childhood home, the easy closeness with his scattered siblings, and his beloved pet. Marmalade had lost his home, his security, his human, and had endured unimaginable hardship. They were both scarred, both survivors of loss and time, but they had found each other again. Against all odds, in the vast anonymity of the city, their paths had converged. The lonely archivist and the traumatized street cat, bound by a shared history, neither had fully understood until now. Arthur gently stroked Marmalade's back, feeling the ridge of the old scar beneath the now softening fur. It was a reminder of the pain, the fear, the long years apart. But it was also a testament to resilience, to the enduring strength of a small creature who refused to give up. "We made it, buddy," Arthur murmured, his voice thick with emotion. We both made it." Marmalade responded with a deeper purr, snuggling closer, seeking warmth and safety in the presence of the human he had first loved as a tiny, notched-eared kitten, and had, through some miracle of instinct and fate, found it again. The quiet apartment no longer felt empty. It felt full, full of history, full of resilience, and full of the profound, unspoken comfort of a second chance. They had both lost so much, weathered so many storms alone, but now, finally, they are home, and this time they wouldn't leave each other. The archivist and his long-lost cat, together against the quiet backdrop of the old Cincinnati neighborhood, ready to face the future side by side. A poor widow found an injured orange cat at her door. What happened afterward was truly unexpected. The little house on Elm Street stood nestled between others much like it, modest, single-story homes, built when the nearby factory was still humming and the town felt full of promise. Now the factory was quiet, and the neighborhood had settled into a kind of worn, comfortable stillness. For Eleanor Vance, 74 years old and 6 years a widow, that stillness often felt less like peace and more like a heavy silence, echoing the absence of her husband Arthur. Life in the small Ohio town continued its rhythm, but Eleanor's own world had shrunk considerably. Her days were marked by routine, waking early, the slow ritual of making coffee, reading the local newspaper, a habit Arthur had insisted on, tending the few African violets lined up on the kitchen windowsill. These small tasks structured her time, pushing back against the vast empty hours. Her Social Security checks covered the bare essentials: property taxes, heating oil, electricity, but left little room for anything else. To supplement her income, Eleanor relied on her skills and the kindness of neighbors. She'd mend clothes for Mrs. Gable next door, whose eyesight wasn't what it used to be. She might bake an apple pie for the church bake sale, carefully calculating the cost of cinnamon and sugar. Or occasionally watch young Mikey from down the street if his mother got called into an extra shift at the diner. These small exchanges provided a few precious dollars and, just as importantly, brief moments of human connection in her otherwise solitary existence. Her children, a son in California and a daughter in Florida, called dutifully on Sundays, their voices bright but distant, filled with news of grandchildren growing up too fast and lives too busy to allow for frequent visits back to Ohio. Eleanor understood. She didn't want to be a burden, but after she hung up the phone, the silence in the house always seemed to rush back in, louder than before. She missed Arthur keenly, his quiet presence in the armchair opposite hers, the rattle of his newspaper, even his predictable grumbling about the weather. She often found herself talking to his photograph perched on the mantelpiece, sharing snippets of her day as if he were still there to listen. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, stripping the maple trees bare and painting the landscape in shades of gray and brown. A biting wind swept down Elm Street, rattling the storm windows Arthur had so painstakingly installed years ago. Eleanor spent more time indoors, wrapped in a thick cardigan, rationing the heating oil by keeping the thermostat low and closing off the upstairs rooms, now silent repositories of furniture and memories. She reread library books, worked on intricate jigsaw puzzles at the kitchen table, and watched the sparrows squabble over the bird feeder, outside the window. Loneliness wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull ache, a constant companion woven into the fabric of her days. Hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, replaced by a quiet resignation, a sense of just getting through one day to the next. Her life wasn't unhappy, not precisely, but it lacked warmth, color, spontaneity. It felt muted, like an old photograph faded by time, its edges blurring into the encroaching gray of the season and her solitude. The ticking grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from Arthur's parents, measured out the slow, even rhythm of her waiting, waiting for the mail, waiting for spring, waiting, perhaps, for something she couldn't even name. One late afternoon, as dusk began to settle prematurely under a sky heavy with the threat of snow, Eleanor decided to sweep the accumulating dry leaves off her small front porch. The wind whipped them into swirling eddies around her feet. Bundled in her coat and gloves, her breath misting in the frigid air, she worked methodically, the scratch of the broom against the concrete a lonely sound in the quiet street. As she bent to gather a final pile into the dustpan, she heard it a faint, plaintive sound cutting through the wind's moan. It was a weak cry, almost a whimper, seeming to come from the dense, overgrown juniper bushes that bordered the porch steps. She straightened up, listening intently. There it was again, a little stronger this time, unmistakably a sound of distress. Setting the broom down, Eleanor moved cautiously towards the bushes, peering into the shadowy tangle of needles and branches. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then a slight movement caught her eye. Huddled deep within the protective embrace of the junipers lay a small, shivering form, an orange cat. It was desperately thin, its fur matted with dirt and clinging damp leaves. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly injured, and it didn't try to move as she approached. Its eyes, large and luminous in the dim light, flickered open, filled with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. It let out another soft, pitiful mewl that tugged sharply at Eleanor's heartstrings. "Oh, you poor, poor creature," Eleanor whispered, kneeling slowly despite the ache in her knees. "What in the world happened to you?" The cat flinched, but remained still, too weak or too frightened to flee. Eleanor could see a patch of raw, scraped skin on its flank, and the way it held its body spoke of deep pain. It looked utterly defeated, as if it had simply given up. All thoughts of her own solitude, the cold, and her meager resources vanished. This small animal needed help, warmth, safety. Hesitantly, she pulled off her gloves and extended a hand, murmuring soothing words. "It's okay, little one. I won't hurt you." The cat trembled violently at her touch but didn't pull away. Carefully, mindful of the injured leg, Eleanor slid her hands underneath its frail body. It weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold fur and sharp bones. It gave a small, sharp cry of pain as she lifted it, then went limp in her arms, surrendering. Cradling the cat gently against her coat, Eleanor hurried back inside, shutting the door firmly against the biting wind. The warmth of the house felt immediate, a stark contrast to the raw cold outside. She carried the cat straight into the kitchen, the heart of her small home. Laying down an old, clean towel she kept for spills, she gently placed the cat upon it. It immediately attempted to curl into the tightest possible ball, shivering uncontrollably. Eleanor's mind raced. She had no cat food, no supplies. A veterinarian visit seemed impossible. The cost would be far beyond her means. But she had to do something. First, warmth. She found an old cardboard box, lined it thickly with more soft towels, and carefully transferred the cat into this makeshift bed, placing it near the gentle heat radiating from the baseboard radiator. Next, water. She filled a shallow saucer and placed it near the box. The cat ignored it. Recalling her previous cat, Mittens, sometimes enjoyed warm milk, she heated a small amount on the stove, just enough to take the chill off, and offered that in another saucer. The orange cat lifted its head weakly, sniffed the milk, and took a few tentative laps before turning away, closing its eyes in exhaustion. Eleanor pulled up a wooden kitchen chair and sat beside the box, simply watching the shallow rise and fall of the cat's breathing. She didn't know its story, how it came to be injured and alone on her doorstep, or whether it would even survive the night. But in that moment, tending to this fragile life felt like the most important thing in the world. The heavy silence of the house felt subtly altered, charged with a new, uncertain responsibility. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was needed. Eleanor decided to call the cat Rusty. The name seemed to fit the muddy, bedraggled state of his orange coat, holding a whisper of hope for the brighter color hidden beneath. The first few days were precarious. Rusty slept almost constantly, barely moving except for the occasional shiver that racked his thin body. Eleanor tempted him with minuscule offerings: a bit of plain boiled chicken, shredded finely, a spoonful of warm broth, a flake or two of canned tuna fish she bought with carefully guarded coins. He ate little, lapped only a small amount of water, and seemed lost in a world of pain and fear. His injured leg remained swollen and useless, held tightly against his body. Eleanor cleaned the scrape on his side gently with warm water and a soft cloth, relieved to see it wasn't deeply infected. Her heart ached seeing his vulnerability, and she worried constantly about infection or internal injuries she couldn't see. Still, the thought of taking him to a shelter where his chances might be slim given his condition and her inability to pay for extensive care felt like a betrayal. She would do what she could, here in her quiet kitchen. She made a habit of talking to him, her voice low and steady, narrating her simple actions. "Time to check on you, Rusty," she'd murmur before gently examining his wound. "Just making myself some tea. Stay warm now," she'd say as she moved about the kitchen. The sound seemed to soothe him. His trembling would sometimes lessen when she spoke. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rusty began to rally. He started drinking more water, then eating the small meals with a bit more eagerness. One morning, Eleanor found him attempting to groom his matted fur, his rough tongue working diligently despite his weakness. Encouraged, she bought a cheap, soft, bristled brush and began gently grooming him each day. At first, he flinched, but soon he seemed to tolerate, then even lean into the soft strokes, a low, tentative purr beginning to rumble in his chest. It was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had heard in years. As his strength returned, Rusty's personality began to emerge from beneath the layers of pain and fear. He remained cautious, startling at loud noises, but the terror in his eyes was gradually replaced by a watchful curiosity. He started to follow Eleanor's movements around the kitchen and living room, hobbling awkwardly on 3 legs, his injured limb held stiffly off the floor. When she settled in her armchair with a book, he would limp over and curl up on the braided rug nearby. The most touching development was his apparent empathy. If Eleanor sighed heavily, lost in a memory of Arthur, or felt a wave of weariness after a morning spent doing chores, Rusty often seemed to notice. He would limp closer, sometimes making the effort to hop onto the low ottoman and simply sit, gazing up at her face with his steady, intelligent amber eyes. He would blink slowly, occasionally letting out a soft, questioning chirp. Eleanor knew, rationally, that she was likely projecting human emotions onto him, but it felt like understanding, like silent commiseration. He was a companion in her solitude, a quiet listener who didn't offer solutions but simply shared the space, making it feel less empty. Her days found a new rhythm, centered around Rusty's needs and presence. She measured her small budget carefully to ensure she could afford his food. She found herself smiling as she watched him bat playfully at a dust mote, dancing in a sunbeam, or stretch languidly, as much as his leg allowed, after a nap. Caring for him chipped away at the lonely inertia that had settled over her life. He depended on her, and in meeting his needs, she found a renewed sense of purpose. The house felt warmer, brighter, filled not just with the ticking of the clock, but with the soft patting of paws, the contented rumble of a purr, and the unexpected blossoming of affection. Rusty, the bedraggled scrap of fur she'd rescued from the cold, was rescuing her right back. Weeks turned into a month, then nearly 2. December arrived, bringing festive decorations to neighbors' windows, but only reinforcing the quietness within Eleanor's home. Rusty, however, was a small beacon of warmth against the winter gloom. His recovery, while slow, was steady. His coat, diligently brushed by Eleanor, had regained much of its vibrant ginger hue, though he remained lean. He navigated the downstairs rooms with surprising agility on 3 legs, his injured leg still carried stiffly, but seeming to cause him less acute pain. He ate well, sought out Eleanor's lap whenever she sat down, and filled the house with his quiet but constant presence. Eleanor had long since stopped thinking of him as a temporary visitor. He was Rusty, her cat, her companion. The possibility of him belonging elsewhere had faded from her conscious thought, buried under the daily routines of care and the comfort of their shared existence. He was woven into the fabric of her life now, an essential thread. One chilly evening, Eleanor sat in her usual armchair, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, while Rusty snoozed peacefully on her lap, his purr a soft vibration against her legs. She idly stroked his fur, enjoying the silky feel beneath her fingers. As her hand moved towards his neck, smoothing the thick fur there, her fingertips brushed against something small and firm, hidden deep within the ginger coat. Puzzled, she gently parted the fur. There, nestled against his skin, almost swallowed by the fluff, was a thin, dark collar. It wasn't a flea collar, and it certainly wasn't something she had put on him. Her heart gave an unexpected thump. How had she missed this? Perhaps it had been twisted around or buried too deep in the matted fur when he first arrived, and she hadn't thought to check thoroughly once he started recovering. With slightly trembling fingers, she carefully worked the collar around his neck until a small tarnished metal tag came into view. It glinted dully in the lamplight. Squinting, Eleanor leaned closer to read the tiny engraving. Marmalade? Below the name was a phone number with a local area code, and below that, an address, 114 Chestnut Avenue. Eleanor stared at the tag, the name echoing strangely in the quiet room. Marmalade? Not Rusty? He had another name, a real name given by someone else, and an address not far away, on a street Eleanor knew by reputation as being rather more prosperous than her own Elm Street. The implications hit her with the force of an icy wind. He wasn't hers. He belonged somewhere else, to someone who had named him, cared for him enough to put an ID tag on him. Someone who was likely missing him, perhaps had been searching for him all this time. A confusing storm of emotions swept through her. Sharp, sudden grief at the thought of losing him, the companion who had become so dear. A prickle of guilt had she subconsciously avoided looking too closely for identification, wanting him to be solely hers. And beneath it all, the undeniable weight of responsibility. The right thing to do was clear, however painful. She couldn't keep him, couldn't live with herself knowing someone else might be heartbroken over his disappearance. She looked down at the sleeping cat on her lap, his orange fur rising and falling gently with each breath. He looked so peaceful, so utterly at home. How could she take him from this sanctuary? How could she return him, especially without knowing anything about the life that awaited him? What if they couldn't or wouldn't care for his leg properly? But the tag was undeniable proof of a prior life, a prior bond. She couldn't ignore it. After a long, sleepless night spent wrestling with her conscience and her heart, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She carefully wrote down the information from the tag on a notepad she kept by the phone. Finding Marmalade's owner was the only honorable path, even though every step towards Chestnut Avenue felt like walking towards a precipice, threatening the fragile peace Rusty had brought into her world. The first attempt yielded nothing. The phone number etched onto Marmalade's tag led only to the flat, final sound of a disconnected line. This left the address. For 3 days, Eleanor postponed the inevitable, finding excuses. The weather was too icy, she needed to buy groceries, she wasn't feeling well. But the slip of paper with the Chestnut Avenue address sat on her kitchen counter, a constant, quiet accusation. Finally, steeling herself, she bundled up against the sharp January air and set out on foot. Chestnut Avenue felt different from Elm Street. The houses were larger, set back further from the road, the lawns tidier, the cars newer. It felt like a world away from her own quiet, make-do existence. Finding number 114, a well-kept but unassuming brick house, Eleanor felt a pang of renewed anxiety. What would she say? Who would she find? Taking a shaky breath, she walked up the cleared pathway and rang the doorbell. The chime echoed faintly within. After what felt like a very long minute, the door opened to reveal a woman who looked to be in her late 40s or early 50s. She had kind eyes, but they were shadowed with a weariness that went beyond simple tiredness. Lines of strain were visible around her mouth, and her posture seemed slightly slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Hello," the woman said, her voice soft, questioning. Eleanor gripped her purse strap tightly. "Good afternoon. My name is Eleanor Vance. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I believe I may have found your cat." The woman's expression shifted from polite inquiry to cautious confusion. "My cat?" "An orange cat," Eleanor elaborated, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "He turned up on my doorstep back in November, injured. I took him in. Just recently, I found a collar with an ID tag. It said Marmalade, and it had this address. At the name Marmalade, the woman's face crumpled. Raw emotion, shock, disbelief, then overwhelming relief and sorrow washed over her features. Her hand flew to her chest, and tears instantly sprang to her eyes. Marmalade? She choked out, the word thick with unshed grief. You found him? Oh, thank God. I truly thought he was gone. She stepped back, gesturing Eleanor inside with a trembling hand. Please, come in, please. You must tell me everything. Eleanor found herself in a hallway that felt strangely empty despite being neat. Boxes were stacked against one wall, bearing labels like Kitchen, Misk, and Tom's Books, hinting at recent turmoil or an incomplete settling in. The woman led her into a living room furnished sparsely with a sofa, an armchair, and not much else. It felt less like a cozy home and more like a temporary stopping place. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Miller. As Eleanor recounted the story, finding the shivering cat in the cold, the makeshift bed near the radiator, the slow recovery, the discovery of the tag, Sarah listened with rapt attention, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. She interrupted only with quiet questions about his health, his leg, murmuring, "Oh, the poor baby," and thank you, repeatedly. When Eleanor finished, Sarah took a deep breath and shared her own story, her voice trembling with remembered pain. Her husband, Tom, had died suddenly just 4 months earlier, a massive heart attack that shattered her world. Marmalade had originally been Tom's cat, his shadow, his constant companion. In the devastating aftermath of Tom's death, Sarah had been forced to sell their larger family home, the place Marmalade had known all his life. Overwhelmed by grief, legal matters, and the sheer logistics of packing up years of shared life, she had moved into this smaller, more affordable house on Chestnut Avenue. It was during the chaos of the move, with boxes everywhere and doors constantly opening and closing, that Marmalade, already disoriented by Tom's absence and the unfamiliar surroundings, must have slipped out unnoticed. Sarah hadn't realized he was missing until hours later. She had spent weeks searching frantically posters, calls to shelters, walking the streets day and night, calling his name until her voice was hoarse. The loss of Marmalade, on top of losing Tom, had been almost unbearable. He was the last living thing I had left of Tom, she whispered, wiping her eyes. When I couldn't find him, I just assumed the worst. Another loss I just had to accept. Eleanor listened, her heart aching with empathy. This wasn't the story of careless owners, but one of profound grief, upheaval, and compounded loss. Sarah's pain was palpable, raw, and recent. The simple act of returning a lost cat had become entangled in layers of sorrow and shared vulnerability. There were no easy answers here, only two women, strangers until minutes ago, linked by their affection for one small, resilient orange cat. Could I possibly see him? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with hesitant hope. Just to know for myself that he's all right? Of course, Eleanor replied without hesitation. It felt essential now, for both their sakes. Sarah followed Eleanor back to Elm Street in her own car, the short drive thick with unspoken emotions. As they stepped into Eleanor's warm, familiar kitchen, Rusty Marmalade lifted his head from the braided rug where he'd been napping near the radiator's comforting warmth. He blinked his amber eyes, taking in the stranger. Sarah sank slowly to her knees a few feet away, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Marmalade?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Oh, Marmee, it really is you." The cat watched her intently. After a moment, he gave a soft chirp, a sound Eleanor had come to know well. He didn't rush forward, but he didn't retreat either. Sarah extended a tentative hand, palm up. Marmalade sniffed her fingers cautiously, then, to Eleanor's surprise, leaned forward and briefly rubbed the side of his head against her knuckles, a fleeting but clear gesture of recognition before settling back down to observe her. Sarah didn't try to force contact. She simply stayed there on the floor for a long time, talking softly to him, her gaze taking in his condition, the healed scar, the way he held his injured leg, but also the brightness in his eyes, the healthy sheen returning to his coat. She saw the clean food and water bowls nearby, the soft brush lying on the counter, the cozy bed in the corner, the cushion reserved for him on the ottoman in the living room. Most importantly, she saw the quiet, undeniable bond between the cat and the elderly woman who had saved him. She watched the way Marmalade looked towards Eleanor, the way Eleanor spoke to him with gentle familiarity, the comfortable peace that existed between them. They sat at Eleanor's small kitchen table drinking tea, the cat now dozing again on the rug between them. Sarah spoke more about her struggles, the loneliness in the too-empty house, the difficulty managing finances alone, the overwhelming sense of starting over when all she wanted was her old life back. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own quiet loneliness before Rusty's arrival, the way his presence had filled the silence and given her days meaning again. Finally, Sarah looked directly at Eleanor, her eyes clear now, though still shadowed with sadness. "You gave him his life back, Eleanor," she said softly. "He wouldn't have survived that night without you, and look at him now." Her gaze drifted towards the sleeping cat. "He's safe. He's warm. He's home." The word hung in the air. Sarah took another deep breath, the decision settling visibly on her face, a mixture of pain and resolution. "When I lost Tom, I thought my heart couldn't break any further. Then Marmalade disappeared, and it did. Finding him today, it's more than I ever hoped for, but seeing him here," she gestured around the cozy kitchen, "seeing how much he clearly loves you and how much you love him, how can I possibly tear him away from this?" She reached across the table, her hand briefly covering Eleanor's. "He's where he needs to be, Eleanor. He chose you in a way, and you chose him. I want him to stay with you." The words were firm, though tears welled again. "Knowing he's happy, knowing he's cherished, that will bring me more peace than taking him back to a house that still feels empty and strange ever could." It was an act of profound generosity, born from grief, but rooted in love for the animal they shared. Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes, tears of gratitude, relief, and deep empathy for Sarah's sacrifice. "I will take the best care of him, Sarah," Eleanor promised, her voice choked with emotion. "Always." Before she left, Sarah insisted on giving Eleanor an envelope containing several $100. "For Marmalade," she said firmly, pressing it into Eleanor's protesting hand. "For his food, for his leg, if it ever needs more care, please, it would make me feel better knowing I can still contribute something to his well-being. Think of it as a thank you from both me and Tom." After Sarah drove away, Eleanor sat for a long time in her armchair. Rusty, curled contentedly on her lap, his purr a steady, reassuring rhythm against the quiet backdrop of the house. The silence no longer felt like absence, but like peace. It was a peace shared with a small orange cat who had wandered into her life out of the cold, bringing with him not just companionship, but an unexpected connection to another's sorrow and strength. Their little home on Elm Street felt complete, warmed by the enduring resonance of kindness, sacrifice, and the simple, profound gift of a shared life.